Okay, let's look at a second part of chapter 3. We've covered the demand and shifts in the demand curve. Let's look at the supply curve, which is the opposite of the demand curve. It slopes up to the right. Get over to the supply. Here we are. Amount producers are willing and able to sell at a given price. So there is a direct relationship between price and quantity supplied. Direct relationship. Price goes up, there is more likely to be a higher quantity supplied. Think in terms of wages. And of course, the other things equal applies as well. When we're looking at a movement along a given supply curve, we are only looking at a price change. So price does act as an incentive to produce. But if we think also of wages in a supply curve, obviously if you offer higher wages, you are going to have a larger quantity of workers wanting that job if the wage is higher rather than lower. Same thing. So again, price changes. All of these points here represent a change in price. We know that if there is an increase or decrease in total supply, the curve moves either to the right or the left. The same rules for the demand curve. So these non-priced factors will shift the curve to the right for an increase, left for a decrease. So let's look at examples of things that will shift the supply curve. A change in resource prices. Resources, remember, are the factors of production: land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Everything we produced has some combination of those. So if one of the prices of those inputs changes, that can shift the entire supply curve. So if the price of land, labor, or capital decreases, then we would expect an increase in supply because it's now cheaper to produce at each and every possible price. There's some examples, but let's just go back to the determinants of supply. These aren't really shown graphically. But if we had, for example, under normal circumstances, gas is a huge input in the production for airlines and for delivery services such as UPS and FedEx. If gas prices go down significantly in price, then the supply curve for airlines and UPS would increase or move to the right, and more flights and deliveries could take place at possibly lower prices. So that would be an increase in the supply curve because the input in production went down in price. On the other hand, if we're looking at a farm and the price of fertilizer and pesticides, let's say those increase dramatically, those are inputs in producing for a farm, then the farm may have to produce less or decrease supply because they can't afford to produce as much. So those inputs in production shift the entire supply curve to the right or left. Another factor, technology. Technology really becomes an input in production. And anytime there is an improvement in technology, there will be an increase in supply. Take a simple calculator, for example. I can remember back in the 70s buying calculators and they were behind the glass. You know what I mean by that? That means they were locked up. They were expensive. Now they come in cereal boxes. They're so cheap. I don't know what that little piece of technology is in there, some kind of circuit, but they're so cheap to produce now. So that in a way was a resource price, moving the supply curve to the right, and now those calculators are very, very inexpensive. Looking at number of sellers, obviously if you've got more sellers, you would see an increase in supply, more competition, which would probably bring the prices down to consumers. Taxes at the producer level will likely decrease the supply curve or move it to the left. Taxes are treated as cost by a business, so if it's more costly to produce because taxes are higher, supply curve shift to the left, and that means prices will increase for consumers. Consumers always bear the brunt of those taxes. It's an important thing to remember. Many people are always complaining that corporations don't pay enough in taxes. Those taxes are always borne by the consumers or employees or stockholders. A corporation can't absorb a tax. So a subsidy will usually increase supply. For example, when a vaccine becomes available for coronavirus, government will likely provide subsidies so that supply can increase, price will come down to consumers, and they can get those vaccines inexpensively. The government does subsidize a lot of vaccines now, vaccines that children have to go to school and so forth. Prices of other goods can also shift supply curve if soccer becomes more popular than American football and more profitable. Then many manufacturers would shift production from footballs to produce more soccer balls if they could get higher prices for them. So product expectations from a seller's standpoint can increase or decrease supply depending on the expectation of future prices. Seller expects the price to go up in the future. They may withhold supply now waiting for that price to go up. So all of those things can shift the entire supply curve. Here's some specific examples in your book. Just like the first one, a change in resource prices, a decrease in the price of microchips or computer chips increases the supply of computers. Computers have really come down over the years in price. Now our cell phones do more than most of the mainframe computers did in the 80s. Well, they do more, actually. So all the rest of these are good examples. But when that supply curve and demand curve intersect, we call that equilibrium. Equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. There's no shortage or surplus. And that's what prices are supposed to do, or wages are supposed to do as well. Allocate resources effectively. And if there's no government intervention, and as long as those transactions are voluntary, we would expect that equilibrium price and quantity to be reached. So productive efficiency means goods are being produced in the least costly way. The sellers can sell all their output. Allocative efficiency, the consumers have all they want at that price. So let's look at equilibrium. In this case, we see that it would be a price of $3 and quantity of 7,000. That's equilibrium. What if supply or demand shifts? Now, only one. And just don't assume that just because demand is shifting, that supply is shifting as well. Sometimes they do shift at about the same time, but not always. There's usually something that happens first. So let's take a look at the rationing function of prices and what happens when we have a change in one of those curves, demand or supply. We see in this case an increase in the demand curve, no change in supply. So demand curve is moving to the right. We would expect an increase in the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. For example, recently, this is May or June of 2020, the coronavirus is starting to come to an end, we hope, or at least it's declining. But in the very beginning of the coronavirus epidemic, there was a huge increase in demand for facial masks, and they were hard to find. They were selling out. That increase in demand caused the price to go up. They were more expensive. There were those that were able to hoard those masks and then sell them at a higher price to consumers or to willing buyers. It's not really price gouging. There's no law against it, even though it may have been unethical. But there was an increase in demand, and the prices did go up, and they were more expensive. On the right-hand side, we see a situation where there's a decrease in demand. There's been a dramatic decrease in demand for air travel during the pandemic. Prices have plunged for many flights, very, very inexpensive. Some of those flights can be obtained for cheaper than it would be to even drive somewhere. But that decrease in demand, no change really in supply, has brought prices down. I'm sure they will start to edge back up as people start traveling again. Figures C and D show what happens when you see a change only in the supply curve. For example, in recent years, the fracking process, hydraulic fracturing, has really increased the barrels of oil produced in the United States. We are now the world's largest oil producer. That increase in supply, demand didn't change very much, has brought prices down considerably. And The opposite on the right-hand side happened in the 1970s. Late 1970s, the U.S. placed an oil embargo against buying oil from the Middle Eastern countries. And the U.S. was not producing that much of its own at the time. So that decrease in the supply curve caused huge increases in gas prices. And it was part of the thing that led to a great deal of inflation in the 1970s and early 80s, which we will talk about in a chapter later on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. We had stagflation in the 1970s, high inflation and high unemployment. And a lot of that was from the oil prices going up so high, and we didn't have very much in the United States. So in that case, we saw an increase in equilibrium price, but we also saw decreases in equilibrium quantity as people moved up along that given demand curve and stopped buying as much because it was so expensive. So in the next video or audio voiceover, we're going to look at more complex cases where supply and demand change. And they're a little bit more complex. But remember that when supply only changes or demand only changes, you'll definitely see a new equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. When both of them are shifting, you may not be able to tell that both of those are changing. Usually something happens first, but sometimes they're happen almost at the same time. And we'll look at that in the next voiceover.